we live in a busy world, a very fast-paced world. So it's more important than ever that we take the time to slow down. And in the world of communication, it means take the time to slow down, to focus on our core message so that we can identify what's important and what's not.
Presentation Zen is an approach, not really a method. You know, a method is something you pull off the shelf and can follow step by step. So Presentation Zen is really about an approach to seeing, to identifying the problem in a way that will help you make much better presentations. So, you know, every presentation basically has three chunks, right? You have the preparation and you have the design, and then in the end you have to deliver it. And that's pretty much standard with every presentation. So I've taken three ideas out of the world of Zen, which are very, very simple ideas. The first one is restraint. Restraint especially applies to preparation. We want to identify what's important and what's not, and take what's not important for the moment and put that aside. And that takes a lot of willpower and to restrain ourselves to let go of our babies and leave those out, at least for the moment. The second thing is simplicity. Well, but what does simplicity mean? Simplicity means many different things for many kinds of people, but basically it means the old, you know, less is more kind of thing. Visually, we want to include only what's necessary to get the point across, and the superfluous and the non-essential can be removed for the time being. And the third thing, of course, when we're talking about delivery, is naturalness. How can you make your delivery a much more natural and much more engaging type of thing? And of course, words like conversation come to mind. People like Steve Jobs, of course, who, even though he's speaking to, let's say, 5,000 people at a Macworld, he comes across in a very conversational manner. So that's sort of the goal with naturalness. Every week I get emails from people who have read Presentation Zen or who follow the blog. And recently I got an email from a technologist in India who said that really following this approach sort of changed his life in a way because he had this great content, but his presentation sort of followed the same old way, the sort of death by bullet point approach. And he took some of these ideas, made it much more visual, much more engaging. He himself became a much more engaging figure, and it changed his life because people were listening and they were getting his important message. So I think no matter what field you're in, if you look at Presentation Zen and follow the approach, keeping in mind, you know, the restraint, design, simplicity, all of that, I think you'll be prepared to make really, really incredibly great presentations. Now, what is a slidegement? Well, that's a slide and document. You put it together and you get a slidegement. And this happens when people try to kill two birds with one stone. The only problem is no birds are killed, which is great if, you know, you're a bird, but for everyone else, we get a document that sort of looks like this, where there's not enough information to be a useful document, and there's too much information, certainly too much text, to be a visual. And this is what happens when we don't exercise restraint. The opposite of restraint to me is actually laziness, right? Or, you know, we just don't take the time to bother with this idea of paring down and focusing on what's important. So one piece of advice then is to remember in the preparation stage that you can have a proper handout and that you should make a proper handout. And if you do that, in the handout, that's where more of the details can go. And it can be spelled out, it can be written out in a very logical fashion. And if you do that up front, then you won't feel compelled to cram your slides with lots of information that you don't actually need, but you sometimes put it in there, well, just in case, right? Someone says, well, what about this piece of data? Well, if it's in the handout, then you won't feel compelled to do that. So you might be saying, what's Zen got to do with it? And you know, I actually have lived in Japan for almost 20 years, except for times when I was in graduate school or when I worked for Apple. I've been living in around Tokyo or Osaka or even in the Japanese countryside. So Zen, which was born in India and then moved to China and grew up in China, but really took root and flourished in Japan. And it's at the heart of Japanese culture. And we don't verbalize Zen, of course, on the streets of Japan, but it is there. And for me, it's been a very sort of profound experience studying the Zen arts. And I've seen that you can apply the principles and the principles of Zen and Zen practice to many aspects of life, including work and including presentations. There are many concepts in Zen, but for me it's all about simplicity. And simplicity, which sort of has gotten a bad rap, certainly in the United States and in the Western world in general, simplicity is not about dumbing things down or leaving out what's important or sort of, trying to skirt an issue, for example. Simplicity is actually quite profound and very powerful, and it isn't even easy to do. But by the end of this video, and if you read the book, I think you'll have some concepts that will help you, leverage this idea of simplicity and bringing out what's important and leaving the non-important behind. So simplicity isn't necessarily simple to do, but for our audience, for our end users, it will be, extremely powerful to do. The first step in the preparation process is to identify the core, to identify, the real essential thrust of the presentation. And one way to do that, really the first thing, is to first clear your mind so that you can identify what's important. And this brings up something that I learned from the world of Zen, which is called the beginner's mind, or sometimes it's called the child's mind. And what that means is, we are all experts, of course, in our fields, but if you adopt the beginner's mind or the child's mind, there are many possibilities to a problem. As experts, we kind of get locked into the traditional way of thinking about things, and we know of myriad of ways, of many possibilities of why this can't be done or why that hasn't been done. So in the beginner's mind, they say, there are many possibilities. But in the expert's mind, there are few. So although we are experts to some degree or another, if we just sort of put that aside for a while and just look at the problem in a new way, we can often sort of see things that we didn't know were actually there. And that's very important when we're trying to identify the core. Okay, but how? How do we clear our mind? How do we adopt a beginner's mind so that we can identify what's important? So one thing I always recommend is to go analog. And what I mean by that is to not prepare at the computer, but to get a million miles away from the computer, actually. So if you can't do that physically, then just turn off the computer so that you won't be distracted. And in fact, when we're on the computer, we're always online, aren't we? And it is said that the always online person is sort of the always distracted person. So if you get off the grid, that is, get offline, get away from the computer, you sort of have the freedom now to just focus on what's important. I recommend taking a legal pad or some notebook or something like that, or maybe just a whiteboard in a conference room by yourself, but get away from technology so that you can identify what's important and what's not. So while we're off the grid and we're thinking about our presentation, this reminds me of a phrase that we often say, that I often say in Japanese, which is dakara nani, which just means so what, right? But this is a question we don't often ask ourselves, and we need to ask ourselves in the preparation stage. Long before we even begin to design the presentation, we have to identify what our point is and also why it matters. So when we ask ourselves, what is the meaning and especially why it matters to our audience, that's when we can identify what's important and what's not. And it may be cool to us, but it might not really go back and support the core. And if it doesn't, that's when we just have to cut it out. And this is what we do in the preparation stage that a lot of presenters fail to do. They sometimes say, well, better safe than sorry, so I'll just include that stuff, even if it doesn't really go back to support the point. So remember, always use restraint and ask yourself, is this really important and what does this mean from my audience's point of view, does it help the story? You know, we're hardwired to tell stories and to understand stories. And in fact, you know, before we could write, we were telling stories. I mean, even kids before they enter school and can read and write, they're telling stories. I mean, it's just sort of how we convey information. And the thing about story is that story has a natural structure to it. You know, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. This happened, and then this happened, and then this goes back to the core message for, you know, more meaning. We can zoom into the particular, but pull out to the general. But again, it all goes back step by step, goes back to the core message. And actually, there's a great book that I read last year called Made to Stick by the Heath brothers. And they talk about stickiness and how great messages have this element of stickiness. And I think this really applies to this idea of story and storytelling. So let's take a look at the 6 key messages in the Heath brothers book. Simplicity, unexpectedness, concreteness, credibility, and emotion and story. All sticky messages, and this applies to presentations as well, have this element of story. Again, this happened, and then this happened, and then this followed, which goes back to the core message. Here's an example. You know, you've heard a lot about climate change recently, and there's been a few people that have become quite well known for their presentations about climate change. And you know, there's nothing really new. I mean, at least 20 years or so, people have been talking about this. But there have been a few people who have, you know, learned to present better. They've put together some good visuals, and they've gone out there and sort of been able to connect with people by using some of these elements of stickiness, right? I mean, of keeping the story simple, but not dumbing it down, keeping it very visual. Of course, the sources are credible, so they're believable. They don't fall into the trap of being too abstract, but keeping it real, you know, using data, but also wrapping it in the form of a story. So when it comes to the issue of climate change or global warming, we've really seen a sea change in attitude across the globe. And part of the reason for that is that there have been some credible presenters who have used many of the ideas that we talk about in Presentation Zen to craft stories and deliver those stories in a way that's very memorable. Now, different people have different ways of doing things. This is my process, and something similar works for a lot of people. So let me just share the way I do it. It's basically in 4 steps. The first part is brainstorming, and that's nothing new to most of you. To me, brainstorming is very, very messy. Usually it's on a whiteboard, or it might be in big sort of post-it notes. And that's when you're freely expressing, you're thinking about a problem, you're expressing ideas, and you write it all down. And you don't judge it, as you know, at that time. So it tends to be kind of messy, and it's all up there visually so that we can see it. The second step is what I call grouping. And during the grouping process is when we step back. And that's the great thing about going analog, is that physically you can step back, which is harder to do on a computer. So we're stepping back, we're looking at the whiteboard, and we're seeing themes, or we're identifying, oh, here's something which is the most important, or maybe these 2 things. And through that, we can identify the core, which is basically the one thing. What is the one thing that we really want to say? What's the one thing that is the heart of this? And then after that, we may come up with 3 things, 3 sort of sections that can hold that up. And the example that I'm showing here is about fitness and having a healthier life. I worked with a client, and their goal was to give good health advice. But their main idea was that you, the patient, are in charge. So in spite of everything else, things like genetics and obesity and all these things, that you are in charge. Now, from the whiteboard, from all the brainstorming, we identified 3 key areas: diet, exercise, and mind, you know, how relaxation. So from that, after they identified those were the 3 key areas that they wanted to use, they went deeper and gave specific concrete advice in those 3 areas without ever losing track of the key message of you're in charge. Okay, so we've looked at brainstorming, and then we've gone into grouping, where we identify the core and we also identify the structure. Usually it's in 3s, it can be in 2s or in 4s, but we have a solid structure to it now. And the next step is to go to storyboarding. Now you can storyboard actually still away from the computer. You can do it on a piece of paper. You can actually in PowerPoint just print out a blank slide, but still on paper away from the computer, you sort of take those core ideas, that structure, and then map them out visually into different slides. So that's storyboarding away from the computer, but of course eventually you have to put it into PowerPoint or Keynote, and that's when you open up slide view so that you can see all the slides, so you can get a sort of a visual picture of where the story is going to go. So the question is, why not just storyboard right on the computer in the slide view? And for some people that works. And I don't know if there's a lot of scientific evidence on this, but my experience, this was at Apple and this is looking at inside other companies in Silicon Valley and even in Japan, even if the end product is going to be very much digital, in the beginning phase, when we storyboard it out, we still do it on paper or on a whiteboard. But the advantage of that is you can step back from it, and you can tape the paper to the wall. And that just, I don't have any clear evidence that this is the best way, but I know that for most of the pros, that's the method that they use as well. So here's an actual example from a presentation that I did about a year ago. So this is called Zen and the Art of Presenting, as you can see on the legal pad there. And the goal really, people, if we're lucky, will remember one thing a few weeks later. So my goal was to get the audience to realize that there's a different way to present with slideware, with PowerPoint or with Keynote, and to sort of increase their awareness. You can see that I've identified the three underlying themes, which are the same ones that are in the book and in this video, which is restraint, simplicity, and naturalness. And then the structure that really gives, that is sort of the meat around the presentation, is also related to the three hunks of the book and the video, which is preparation, design, and delivery. Okay, so now we're in slide sorter view, and you can see all the slides in our presentation. You can see the title slide, of course, very simple, the naked presenter. And then I take some time to explain what does it mean, what does naked presenter mean? It's a catchy title, but it comes from the idea of hadaka no tsukiai, which means in Japanese, basically, naked we're all the same. So it's sort of a metaphor for, efficient, honest, real communication. So I set that up, set the stage, but then it's very clear. The structure is extremely clear and visual. You can see it right here. There's preparation, visuals, and delivery. And you don't always have to be that explicit with the structure, but in this case, it worked very well to do it that way. I wrap it up by showing that same slide again, just so it's sort of the ending. Here we are, preparation, visuals, and delivery. That sort of wraps it up. And then go to Q&A, and what you'll notice is that Q&A, and it doesn't always have to follow this structure, but Q&A is not the last thing. So I don't end on Q&A, and that's why you'll notice that there are still a few more slides where, again, I sort of review what are the key points. The key point was, remember, you can present in a different way, and that's what I wanted you to remember. So when it comes to preparation, what does all this mean? And for me, the core takeaways are this. The first thing is you got to get off the grid and get a million miles away from the computer, as I said. And whatever works for you. It might be riding a bike to the bay or just going to a coffee shop with your legal pad or a notepad or whatever. There are many ways to do this. But when you get away from the computer, you can then identify the core and really focus on what's important and leave the rest out. And also during this stage, of course, is when you identify the structure and you can give it a story and a sort of step-by-step, structure to it. And then finally, with this sort of organization that we have, this leads very nicely into the next step or the next stage, which is design. And now I'd like to move on to the design stage. And in the design stage, the underlying theme is simplicity. Now, simplicity is important, of course, through all stages, but especially when we're talking about design and talking about visuals. And there are many concepts that you can keep in mind when we're talking about visuals and designing our visuals. I will talk specifically about 7 very useful principles. But before that, I thought it would be interesting to do something a little bit different and talk to you about 3 principles that I got from the world of Zen and the Zen arts that is a little bit different, but you actually can apply these to the world of presentation design as well. The first one is called kanso, which is a Japanese word for simplicity. It's one of the Japanese words for simplicity, which basically means less is more. So think subtraction, not just addition, or look at a design and ask yourself, what could I eliminate here rather than add to it to make it more powerful? The next one is shizen, which basically just means naturalness. And as it applies to visual design, it really is the opposite of slick. We don't want an overly designed or sort of overly slick or artificial. You want designs that are, good looking and very effective, but not sort of forced creativity. The next one is called shibumi. Now, this one's a little bit hard to explain because it has many different meanings depending on the context. But when we're talking about visual design, the idea of shibumi is basically about elegant simplicity or articulate brevity. You can think in terms of suggestion rather than just really, beating someone over the head with it visually. So these ideas really get back to the idea of simplifying, and that if you simplify, you can actually amplify your message. Amplification through simplification is an idea that people like Scott McCloud has talked about in his book on comics. And the thing is, amplification through simplification is not an idea that is very common with most people. Most people try to avoid simplifying because they think it's going to actually weaken their design. But the thing is, if you keep this in mind, amplification through simplification will actually make your designs much more powerful. So now let's look at 7 design concepts from the world of graphic design that have real applications to our world of slide design. So the first concept is called signal-to-noise ratio, and this is actually borrowed from the more technical fields such as radio communications. So you can think of signal as the message, and the noise, of course, is the clutter, the part that just interferes with that message. On your radio, of course, if you have a low signal-to-noise ratio, the noise, of course, is the static, and that's what gets in the way of the message. In our world, then, the signal are the visual elements that contribute to our message, and the noise is anything that detracts from our message. So noise can include things like, footers and logos and decorative elements that really don't add anything, and they act then as noise. Even though we're not conscious of it sometimes, it really gets in the way of our message. So when you look at this slide, what's the first thing that comes to mind? When I look at this, I see lots of noisy elements that just aren't necessary. For example, at the bottom, you see a footer. All these things, the date, the title, these really aren't necessary. The logo, not necessary. You can remove that. When you look at boxes, now a lot of default settings sometimes in slideware has boxes around text or around other elements. We don't need these lines around the text or even around the graph itself. When you look at the chart, the axis lines on the chart, vertical and horizontal, you really don't need those. You can either make them very, very thin or remove them altogether, because the bars actually will suggest lines anyway. And speaking of the bars are in 3D also with thick lines, and 3D is not necessary, especially when we're talking about 2D data, right? When you look at the bars, you'll notice that they're in many different colors, right? 6 different colors, 6 different bars. Why is that? There's no reason for that, right? That's just somehow decorative. I would suggest that you make them all one color, except if you wanted to have people look at a particular year. Let's say, for example, 2005 was the year that you wanted to point out. You could make that bar a different color. Now, what about the picture? Now, pictures, I'm actually a big fan of high quality photography in slides, but it's not always necessary. In this case, I think the photo actually detracts. It's just a sort of noise that detracts from this idea of just looking at the data. Data itself is visual. The data itself is graphical. So in this case, I don't think it really adds anything. And speaking of noise, what's the deal with bullet points? Whoever said that you should fill a slide with bullets and that this was an effective visual? Well, the thing is, actually, if most presentation books that you buy will suggest something like the 177 rule or a variation of that. What is the 177 rule? The 177 rule says basically that you should have only one main idea per slide. Well, that's a good idea. I agree with that. Insert only 7 lines of text maximum. Use only 7 words per line maximum. The question is, though, does this work? Is this method really good advice? Is this really an appropriate, effective visual? This slide has just 7 bullet points. Now, This slide is actually an example of a slide that would follow conventional wisdom about what is a good, simple slide. But this is not visual at all. This is a great example, actually, of noise, because we cannot read and listen at the same time. In this case, this kind of text on a slide just becomes clutter in my eyes, and it doesn't contribute to the person standing there, it doesn't contribute to the narrative. So the picture superiority effect is quite simple. It simply says that we remember pictures and photographs, for example, better than other forms such as words. And we all know this to be true. In fact, our most dominant sense is actually visual. So let's look at some examples here. All right, so look at this slide. Now, when the speaker presented against this slide, his main point was that blogs are like sharks because you have to keep your blog updated or it will die. People will lose interest. Just like a shark, if a shark doesn't keep moving, the shark will die, right? The thing is, this slide is not very visual. It's not visual at all, and the words are there in bullet points repeating what he's already said. Now, if you look at this slide instead, this slide is very visual and very effective to get the point across. Now, there are no words except blogs are like sharks. And in this sense, the words along with the picture becomes a powerful visual. And they don't get in the way at all of the presenter and his narrative. So his spoken word along with this full bleed photograph and his key point, blogs are like sharks, together make a very, very powerful and memorable message. But also keep this in mind, picture superiority doesn't just mean pictures or photography. It also means things like quantitative displays, bar charts or a line chart. That is also a strong visual element. So when we say picture, we really mean anything which isn't just text or noise on a slide. So the next concept is called empty space, sometimes called negative space, but I love the term empty space. You can see empty space used in graphic design and layout design, web design, and of course in our world of slide design. The thing is, most people see empty space and want to fill it. And that includes not only in design, but even in their own homes, right? Oh, I have space over here. Let me fill it with more junk. So the thing about empty space is that empty space is not nothing. It's actually a powerful something. And when you leave that area empty, it actually contributes more to those visual elements that are in the positive space. Now, if you look at a lot of the Zen arts, you'll notice that there is balance, but it's not a symmetrical balance usually, it's more asymmetrical. And some people actually say that that's the opposite of balance, but you can also think of it in terms of balance, but asymmetrical balance. So you might have empty space in one area or a lot of empty space which balances out, let's say, deep sort of elements or very powerful elements on a different part of the slide. If you look at this slide here, you'll notice it's rather a traditional kind of slide with a title and bullet points, and there's not much empty space at all, or certainly not a good use of empty space. Now, instead, remember, we don't need the words on the slide, or so many words on the slide, because the presenter is going to be speaking those words. So look at this slide, this first one. You see the text element, hara hachibu, and the visual element on the right, but most of the slide is actually empty. And with these there's actually three elements. Most people might see two elements. They see the text and they see the visual, but there are actually three. And the thing is, they work in harmony to provide balance. They don't get in the way of each other. We're sometimes not conscious of this, but these three elements work in harmony and work in balance. It's asymmetrical balance, but it works very, very well to support our narrative visually. So the idea of empty space used in visuals is not just limited to the world of Zen, of course. It's something that we use in the Western world as well, in graphic design and other areas of visual design. One thing that I think is really effective is this idea of rule of thirds, which originally sort of came from the golden mean. But the rule of thirds is used by many designers, especially photographers, when they're trying to compose an image. So let's look at some examples here in our world of slide design. So when you look at this slide, you'll notice that I actually put down a grid following the rule of thirds, so it's broken up into thirds. You'll notice that a strong visual element, the person running there, takes up the right third, and even the ground and the mountains take up the bottom third, and then the text element is over there on the upper left third. So it's not by accident, and there's large empty space there that is a really sort of natural space for the text, and it also naturally leads the eye from the right to the left. Here are some more examples of slides that use the rule of thirds to utilize effectively empty space. So I said there were 7 design concepts, and we've looked at the first 3, and now let's look at the last 4. And these 4 I've actually grouped together in what I call the big 4, and they are contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Okay, let's begin with contrast. Now, I think contrast is actually the most important of the 4, and you can achieve contrast in many different ways. For example, black and white, color, size, and shape. But contrast is really about difference and showing difference, and we don't want to just show a little difference, we often want to show a big difference. Okay, let's look at these first set of slides. And the first one here, the blue one, the blue background, you'll notice that the text really doesn't stand out. The text is white, but the background is kind of white, so there's just weak contrast, right? If you look at the next one, you'll see that the text is white and also larger, and the background is very different than white. It's almost black. It's a very, very dark gradient. So that's one. Color was used to achieve contrast, but also size. You'll notice that we wanted to draw attention using contrast, let's say to the word big. So it's much bigger, and also it's bled off the page a little bit, which is sort of interesting, and it's another way to draw attention via contrast. Okay, this example is a little bit different, because if you look at this first slide, you actually can understand the graphic and you can see it, but it takes more work to see it because the background template has a lot of elements that aren't necessary. Again, these are noisy, right? But we could also say this has weak contrast because the background has too much salience. And as you can see, it's hard to see the word rate, for example, in the title, and there's just a lot of noise. It makes it harder to see the text. In the different treatment of the same data, it's just very, very easy. And even though this background does have some patterns on them, they're very, very subtle. So the contrast between the foreground and the background is really good. And of course, the text is white, the background is almost black, and it's very, very easy to see. Also, we've used color as a contrast technique because we want people to notice South Korea. That's where we want you to look, and that's where your eye is going to go because it's red and the other bars are gray. So the whole idea behind contrast is that it's a great concept and a great technique that you can use to achieve very powerful and very clear images. It doesn't matter how many you use. You don't have to use many different techniques like big and small, different shapes and so on. But if you use 1 or 2, it can be very powerful and effective. So the second concept is repetition. And repetition is very simple. It just means that you repeat certain design elements throughout your design, in our case throughout the slide deck. Now, the thing is with PowerPoint or Keynote, many elements are already built in. For example, when you choose a template, it will have the same background color, the same kinds of fonts, the same color font, and so on. But that is repetition, but that can get a little boring as well. So we're talking about taking it even a step further. And you might have certain elements that are repeated, not in every slide, but are repeated in just certain slides in a way that fit the theme. For example, in this video, you may have noticed as the concepts have been introduced, there has been one design element that has been repeated. And the reason that we do that is to bring the sections together in a sort of a unified whole. The next design principle is alignment, and the whole idea behind alignment is that nothing should seem accidental or random on your slide. Elements are connected in some way, and that's through alignment. It's best to explain this principle by actually looking at an example. So take a look at these slides here. Now, this is an example of a title slide, and you'll notice usually we centered things, or you might flush to the left. But in this case, we've flushed all the text to the right, and you can see the main title, the subtitle, the name, and then the logo are all lined up on the right, and this forms an invisible line, vertical line, running along the right side. Here's another example, returning to the Hare Hachibu slide. Now, in this case, the text isn't exactly aligned with the eyes, but it's aligned in such a way that, although again, we're not conscious of it, but the eyes and the text sort of go together. So it sort of flows naturally. The next concept is called proximity, and the idea behind proximity is that elements that are related should be closer together and things which are not related should be further apart. You know, elements that are close together, the audience is going to assume that they're somehow related, and if they're not, then they should be at a greater distance. And again, it's best to explain this with a simple example. So look at this title slide here. You can see 4 text elements plus a logo. And in this case, it's really hard to tell which is more important, right? We see principles of presentation design. The second line is actually a subtitle, and then there's the name and his position. But it's not really clear which is more important than the other. In this example, the second example, it's very, very clear. So the first 2 lines of text are close together because they're more related. It's the title, the main part of the title, and then the subtitle. And then down below is the name. So the name and the gentleman's position, those are together. And the logo, again, is separated because that's the third element. So now we see there's actually 3 elements, not 5 elements. So when I look at this slide, the main problem is I just can't read the text. So how could we improve this? And in this slide, this is the title slide, and here there were 2 things. The first thing is proximity. Before the text was far apart. In this case, it's really come together as 2 text elements. It's the title with the subtitle in close proximity, and then the name, which is very separate, so it's further away. And then the idea of contrast. So now the background behind the text is almost black, which contrasts very well with the white, and then the photograph below eases in, and it's another element which draws us in. So remember, these design concepts are not hard and fast rules. They're simply guides, and not every concept will apply to every slide or every visual. If you want more examples, you can look at my book where I do highlight all of the concepts and others as well. But you know, you can find these examples of these concepts used in graphic design in the world around you. In fact, that's where I get a lot of my inspiration, and where I've learned a lot over the years how to apply the concepts is, for example, driving down the road and looking at billboards, or on the train when I'm on the subway. Every morning I'm looking at graphic design and advertisements, and you really can learn a lot, and you can see how professional designers actually do use many of these concepts in all of their designs as well. Okay, so we've looked at preparation and design, and now it's time to move to the delivery stage. Now, we've done a lot of work in the preparation and design, and it takes a lot of time. But in the delivery stage, this is where we put it all together and where we actually perform and present to our audience. And the key tenet running through the delivery stage is one of naturalness. And when I think of naturalness, I have to go back to Steve Jobs again, the master presenter. And this also brings up the issue of rehearsal. People always ask me about this. Does Steve Jobs rehearse a lot to look so natural on stage? And as a matter of fact, there is quite a bit of rehearsal that goes into his presentations. But there are different feelings about this. For some people, they feel that if they rehearse too much, then they'll lose that degree of naturalness. So it depends on your case. Each case is different. In my case, I do rehearse, and the more that I rehearse, then I'm able to be very natural in front of an audience. Because like any master, such as the master swordsman or the master artist in any field, the master has already got the technique down. So they don't have to think about the next step. They don't have to worry about technique. In fact, they don't even worry about winning or losing. At that moment, you begin to think about winning or losing, or how am I doing? That's the moment that you begin to fail, actually. So presentation is an art form in a sense, and it's the art of telling a story. And if you're going to tell a story, you have to make a connection. And if you're worried about technique, you can't make a connection. You have to be right here, right now, in this moment, and that's something the master presenter does really well. You can actually learn delivery skills from some unusual places, even from the world of judo. For example, if you look at Jigoro Kano's 5 principles of judo, you can see that actually all of them to some degree or another can be directly applied to delivery skills. So all five of these can apply to our world of delivering a presentation, but it's two of them in particular that I think have direct relevance. The first one, which is carefully observe yourself and your situation. And although we say it's important to be in the moment, remember the art of presenting or the art of telling a story is also connecting with the audience. And you can't do that if you're not aware of your audience and aware of your surroundings. And of course, the fourth one, which is know when to stop. And this one is almost funny because this is a real problem with most presentations, is that the presenter goes over time or doesn't know when to stop. So given 20 minutes, they take 30, given 40 minutes, they take an hour, and so on. So this is really key. Always know when to stop your presentation. So what about the issue of presenting under fire? You know, you're in a situation where there's a lot of pushback from the audience, or maybe, you know, they're sort of pushing you and disagreeing with you in a kind of aggressive fashion. So how should you deal with that? Well, once again, we can sort of take something from the world of judo. Jigoro Kano had this to say about dealing with an opponent. Victory, he says, over the opponent is achieved by giving way to the strength of the opponent, adapting to it, and taking advantage of it, turning it in the end to your own advantage. Well, you might be saying, what does this have to do with actual presentations, though, when I'm dealing with, presenting under fire or dealing with someone who's quite aggressive? And for me, what this means is that we should always keep to the high ground and never ourselves become emotional, and remain always gracious and courteous and polite, and simply deal with the question at hand. And when we do that, when we keep to the higher ground, we're able to simply deal with the situation and then move on to the next question. One of my favorite presenters who understands the importance of being in the moment and present is Benjamin Zander. Benjamin Zander is actually the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra, but he's also an amazing presenter. And the main takeaway I've gotten from Benjamin Zander is this idea of contribution. You know, a lot of presenters sort of doubt themselves when they're presenting, and they worry, how am I doing? Is the audience liking me? Am I doing a good enough job? But Benjamin Zander says it's all about contribution. And again, at that moment that you begin to doubt yourself or to ask yourself, is this good enough? You know, we need to avoid that kind of thinking. It's simply about being right here, right now, making a contribution with this audience. It's just a presentation after all. And speaking of music, I've learned a lot from the art of jazz. I've been a jazz musician since I was a kid and still perform to this day. And it's funny, I've learned through music that where there is no connection, there can be no contribution. And in the world of jazz, of course the audience is important, but what I'm really talking about is me as a musician working with other jazz musicians on stage. And we have to listen. So I'm aware of myself and I'm aware of what I'm doing, but I'm also at the same time aware and listening to and connecting with the other musicians. Now this translates to the world of presenting. When you're presenting alone on stage, the audiences, in a sense, they're like the other musicians. So you're presenting, you're telling your story, but you're asking questions. They might just be rhetorical questions for a very large presentation, but they are all part of it. Your audience is not removed, they're not something out there, they're actually a part of you, they're a part of your presentation, and that really is at the heart of connection. The other thing I learned from being a musician for all these years is this idea of leaving your audience hungry for more. I mean, you never want to play past the time where they said, okay, that's enough. But think about this if you apply the idea to meetings and presentations. So if someone gives you 20 minutes to make a presentation, take 18 minutes or 19 minutes, but never go over. Or if you have an hour, take 55 minutes. In the history of presentations or meetings, I don't think anyone's ever complained if the meeting was a little bit short. If we're going to make a connection, then we have to remove some barriers. And there are many things that can act as barriers to our ability to connect with an audience. But some of the most common ones are things like turning the lights off when you're giving a presentation. Now, it's true that turning the lights off will make the slides look better, but you have to go for a compromise in that situation because the audience has to see you. If they can't see you, there is no connection. Other things like if there's a podium and you have the option not to use the podium, then don't use it. I say get away from the podium or the lectern so that you can make a connection and get out closer to your audience. Along those lines, are things like using a clip-on mic or a lavalier microphone, a little clip-on. Again, that way it allows you to move around, to get far away from the lectern and the podium and make a connection with the audience. The other thing is to use a small remote control, not a large remote control, but use a small one. And the remote control allows you to, again, walk around, be closer to the audience, and basically go wherever you want to go. And that's very important when we're talking about making a connection. With delivery, remember that the key tenet running throughout is naturalness, right? Naturalness is the goal. And we do that by being in the moment. And if we're in the moment, then we're better able to make a connection and engage our audience. And remember, without connection, there can be no contribution, and no one is going to get our story. So, what's the conclusion? The conclusion is, there is no conclusion. There's only the next step. And the next step is completely up to you. You know, you can make improvements in even very small ways. And this reminds me of a Japanese idea which you may have heard about before called Kaizen. Kaizen means continuous improvement. And in the spirit of Kaizen, even very, very tiny improvements are very important. You don't have to make improvements in huge gains. You can make step-by-step improvements as well. Well, how do you improve? Well, there are many ways. The first thing you can do is just volunteer to present. The more that you present, the better you're going to get. You can present internally in your company. You can volunteer to present for your community group, whatever it is, but look for opportunities to make a presentation or to make a speech. You could volunteer or join a Toastmasters and take advantage of the education that they have within Toastmasters, or even volunteer to make a presentation within Toastmasters. You could also volunteer to make a presentation at Pechakucha, or just find a Pechakucha event in your city and just attend and see how the constraints in Pechakucha really lead to good storytelling. And of course you can read. There are many books on presentations which are very good, of course, and communication, but you can also learn a lot about slide design and communication by reading books about graphic design, web design, interior design, and just design in general. And of course you can also learn a lot by reading the book Presentation Zen and following my thoughts and discoveries on the Presentation Zen blog. But remember, in the end, it's all up to you. Ganbatte kudasai. All over. There are Pechakucha nights in city all, or the rather, more is. I can never get that, so I should just not say it. I'm just gonna say it as if this was the last take ever.
Do it one more time.
So again, when you're away from the computer, you ask yourself these two important questions. Sorry, you. That was a long way to say it. It's all right? All right? All right.
It's all right.
All right.
And action.
So that's a little bit about how I do it. Now you're gonna think, story. Without connection. Very true, those words. Only the next step. Okay. And we can get a connection with our audience if we remember to be in the moment. And I am really hot under these lights. No, it's only hot here.
Yeah.
And this is where my brain is.
Okay. One more time. Where you at?
So.
Okay, ready?
So, Smithers. Excellent. Okay.
Release the house.
Some stooge in Sector Z. Okay.
Do you feel fabulous?
No, don't get me laughing now. Is it?
Flower, big flower.
Listen.
Where is that?
So you.
What's that got to do with it?
Very good it is. As you can see. All in here. Ne. Hi. Don't include that.